With this unsettling warning, you are invited to step into a world of silence and mystery, where the stillness of a funeral home can become something far more sinister. The narration is slow, immersive, and designed to transport you into the quiet corridors of a place where life seems to pause. Funeral homes are spaces where human emotions and energy come together. They're halls and rooms bearing witness to more than just grief. Over the years, many people have shared stories of strange sensations and ghostly encounters in these places, like the old Central Funeral Home or the forgotten viewing rooms of the San Juan Mortuary. These spaces, heavy with the weight of past events, seem to come alive in the silence of the night. Are you ready to discover what happens when the lights go out and the echoes of the past begin to stir? Story 1. Ana Morales never imagined that her quiet night of mourning would turn into a night filled with terror. It was a cold, rainy evening, and she had been at the funeral home since late afternoon, paying her last respects to a beloved family member. The viewing had been emotional, filled with tears, whispers, and the quiet murmur of family and friends coming to offer condolences. By the time most of the visitors had left, it was already well past midnight. Only a few people remained, sitting quietly in the dimly lit room. Ana chose to stay alone with her thoughts, sitting in a chair close to the casket, reminiscing about moments shared with her relative. The soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of old wood were the only sounds that broke the heavy silence. She found herself slipping into a state of calm melancholy, the kind that comes after hours of crying when exhaustion overtakes grief. As time passed, the few remaining family members excused themselves, leaving Ana completely alone in the viewing room. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer across the room. Although the space was dimly lit by soft, warm lighting, there was something about the quiet that unsettled her. Still, she didn't mind being there alone. After all, she wanted one last moment to herself before leaving. She gazed at the casket, lost in thought, when suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure standing at the far end of the room. Startled, she turned her head to see a woman dressed in a long, flowing black gown. The woman stood motionless, her posture straight, and her gaze seemingly fixed on the casket. Ana immediately assumed the woman was another mourner who had come to pay her respects late in the night. There was nothing unusual about someone arriving at odd hours in a funeral home, but what struck Ana as strange was the woman's complete stillness. She didn't move, didn't fidget, and stood almost like a statue. Ana felt a shiver run down her spine. Maybe she's just trying to gather herself before approaching the casket, Ana thought, trying to brush away her unease. Still, the longer she sat there, the more the woman's presence unnerved her. She couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but something about the woman felt wrong. She seemed out of place, even for a funeral home, where grief often manifests in different ways. After several minutes of watching the woman remain motionless at the end of the room, Ana decided to approach her. Maybe she needed help or comfort. Maybe she was lost in her own grief. Ana stood up slowly and walked towards her, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. As she drew closer, she noticed that the woman's head was slightly bowed, her long black hair falling loosely around her face, making it impossible to see her features. "Excuse me," Ana said softly, trying not to startle her. "Is everything okay? Do you need anything?" The woman did not respond, nor did she move. She remained perfectly still, her head lowered, hands clasped in front of her. Ana's heart began to race. A sense of dread crept over her, but she was determined to be polite. She took another step closer. "Are you here to see someone?" Ana asked, her voice trembling slightly. Suddenly, in one fluid motion, the woman lifted her head and turned to face Ana. What Ana saw next froze her in place. The woman had no face. Where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, featureless surface, pale and ghostly under the dim light. Ana's breath caught in her throat as she took an involuntary step back, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The faceless woman stood there, her hollow gaze fixed on Ana, though there were no eyes to meet. Time seemed to slow down, and the air in the room grew colder. Anna felt her body lock in place, paralyzed by fear. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her heart pounded loudly in her ears as she watched the woman's figure begin to fade. The woman's form, still eerily calm, began to dissolve into the shadows that filled the far corners of the room. Her black dress seemed to merge with the darkness, and within moments, she was gone, completely vanished as though she had never been there at all. Anna stood frozen, staring at the spot where the woman had disappeared. Her skin was cold, and her body trembled from the shock. She struggled to catch her breath, her mind racing. Had she imagined it? Was her grief playing tricks on her? No! It had felt too real. She had seen her, or at least something. Unable to shake the fear, Anna rushed out of the viewing room and into the hallway. She had to find anyone, to confirm what had just happened. As she stumbled through the hall, she spotted the security guard who worked the night shift. "Please," she gasped, still shaken. "I need to ask you something." There was a woman in the viewing room, but she wasn't. Anna trailed off, unsure of how to explain what she had seen. The guard's face darkened slightly, and he gave her a knowing look. He seemed unfazed by her panic, which only added to Anna's confusion. "The woman in black?" the guard asked quietly. Anna nodded, her heart still racing. Yes, but she didn't have a face. She was just standing there, and then she disappeared. The guard sighed and looked towards the viewing room. "You're not the first person to see her," he said calmly. "We've had a few others mention her over the years. She's always standing at the far end of the room, usually around this time of night. No one really knows who she is, but she's been seen by more people than I can count." Anna's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. The woman wasn't real, at least not in the way she had thought. But if she wasn't a living mourner, then what was she? The guard offered a small, sympathetic smile. "Best not to think too much about it. These places, they have a way of holding on to things that shouldn't be here." Anna nodded weakly, too stunned to respond. She left the funeral home that night, her mind replaying the encounter over and over again. The woman in black was no figment of her imagination. She was something else, something tied to that room, lingering in the shadows. And now, I ask you, what would you do if you encountered a figure like that in the darkened corner of a funeral home? Would you approach her, or would fear keep you rooted in place, knowing that what you're seeing might not belong to the world of the living? Story 2. The silence and darkness that fill the hallways of a funeral home can often seem alive, breathing with a life of their own, particularly during long nights of vigil. There's something about these spaces, built for mourning and reflection, that feels different once night falls. Shadows stretch longer, sounds seem to echo louder, and the air becomes heavier. It is in these quiet, unsettling moments that the boundaries between reality and the unknown seem to blur. This brings us to the story of Juan Perez, a funeral home employee with years of experience working late shifts. Juan was no stranger to the somber atmosphere of the funeral home at night, and he had learned to embrace the solitude it offered. But one particular night, his routine was interrupted by something that would leave him questioning what he had seen. It was a little after midnight, and the funeral home had emptied out for the evening. The last family had left hours ago, and all that remained were the dimmed lights, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, and Juan's footsteps echoing softly down the hallway. As part of his nightly routine, Juan did a final walkthrough to ensure that all doors were locked and that everything was in order before clocking out. Normally, these rounds were uneventful, but that night, something was different. As Juan walked down the long, narrow corridor that led to the viewing rooms, he suddenly noticed someone coming towards him in the opposite direction. It was a man, dressed in a dark, well-fitted suit, walking at a slow, deliberate pace. At first glance, Juan assumed the man was a relative who had stayed behind after the viewing to collect his thoughts. It wasn't uncommon for mourners to linger in the hallways after everyone else had gone, finding solace in the quiet. Juan nodded politely as the man approached, but the stranger didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he kept walking, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Juan didn't think much of it at first. Perhaps the man was lost in his grief, detached from the world around him. However, as the man passed, something about him didn't feel right. Juan couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an odd chill that accompanied his presence. The man's footsteps didn't make any sound, and despite his slow pace, he seemed to glide more than walk. Juan stopped for a moment and looked back, but the man continued down the hallway without a single glance in his direction. Shrugging off the odd encounter, Juan continued his rounds, though now with a heightened sense of awareness. There was a lingering tension in the air that made him feel uneasy, as if he were being watched. He shook the thought from his mind and focused on finishing his duties. The sooner he completed his rounds, the sooner he could leave. A few minutes later, as Juan approached the end of the hallway, the lights flickered. It was a common enough occurrence in the old building, but tonight, it felt ominous. When the lights stabilized, Juan froze in place. Standing at the end of the hall, where there should have been no one, was the same man in the suit. This time, he was facing Juan directly. His eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed on him, staring intently. The man hadn't made a sound, hadn't moved, but there he was, as if he had been waiting for Juan to notice him. A cold sweat broke out on Juan's forehead as his heart began to race. Something was very wrong. Juan blinked, half expecting the man to disappear, but he remained there motionless, his gaze unwavering. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Juan considered his options. He could continue walking down the hall, past the man, and pretend nothing was amiss, or he could turn around and take another route out of the building. Neither option felt particularly comforting, but he knew he couldn't stand there forever. Summoning his courage, Juan took a cautious step forward. As he did, the lights flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows across the hallway. When the lights came back on, the man had vanished. Juan's pulse quickened. He looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was no way the man could have left so quickly. There were no doors nearby and no turns in the hallway. The only possible explanation was that the man had somehow disappeared. Now, truly unnerved, Juan hurried down the hall, determined to finish his rounds and leave the building as quickly as possible. But no matter how much he tried to calm himself, the image of the man in the suit lingered in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. As he rounded the final corner, the lights flickered one last time, and to Juan's horror, the man in the suit reappeared, standing just a few feet away. This time, he was closer than ever, his face emotionless, his dark eyes locked onto Juan's. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the man stood there, as if he were waiting for Juan to make a move. Juan's breath caught in his throat. Without thinking, he turned and ran. His footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He didn't stop until he reached the front door of the funeral home, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock. Once outside, Juan gasped for air, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. He looked back at the building, half expecting to see the man standing in the doorway, but the funeral home was still, its windows dark and empty. Juan never spoke of that night to anyone, but he couldn't forget the man in the suit. Every time he worked the night shift after that, he was constantly on edge, waiting for the lights to flicker and for the man to reappear. But he never saw him again. To this day, Juan wonders who or what that man was. Was he a lingering spirit, tied to the funeral home by some unresolved grief? Or was he something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the world of the living? And now I ask you, what would you do if you were walking down a dark hallway and saw someone who shouldn't be there? Would you keep walking, hoping they vanish? Or would you turn back, knowing that you might not be able to escape their gaze? These stories are just a small glimpse into the many unsettling experiences that have been shared about funeral homes. Perhaps the next time you find yourself in one of these quiet places and you feel as though something or someone is watching you, it's worth asking yourself if you're truly alone. The silence, the shadows, and the energy that lingers in these spaces have a way of making you question what is real and what might be lurking just beyond your sight. Funeral homes are meant to be places of peace and reflection, but as you've heard, they can also become much more than that after dark. So, next time you step into one of these places, stay alert. The shadows might not always be empty, and the quiet may be filled with more than just memories. And remember, the last one to leave must always turn off the lights and be sure that the doors to the funeral home are securely closed.